Knitting with beads is a fun way to add a little bit of sparkle to your next project. It's a wonderful embellishment technique to use along, say, the cuff of a sleeve on a sweater or the brim of a hat, and it's especially great on the borders of lace shawls. Not only do the beads help to highlight all the detail and intricate lace patterning, but the beads themselves help to actually weigh down your shawl, which helps to keep it laying smooth and flat. Here at knitpicks we have a couple of different sizes for our seed beads. They're available in 6 and 8/0 seed bead sizes. The 6 is the larger size and the 8 is actually the smaller size, and we have them available in a range of colors, and you'll find them in everything from a clear rainbow color to a clear with a silver lining, and then we also have them available in some great colors such as gold, blue, and then red, all of which have a silver lining as well. And then finally, you'll also find there's a really beautiful dark rainbow, which is almost like an oil slick colorway. Now for these seed beads, there's a couple different ways that you can use them to work them into your knitting. There's one method where you string them all onto your yarn before you begin and then work them in as you go. And then the second way is to use a crochet hook and then you work them into your stitches as you go. In this video, we're going to go over how to string beads onto your yarn in order to incorporate them into your knitting afterwards. Now this is going to be our very first step, so this is before we even cast on for our project. The one thing you will use for this method is a very thin, fine gauge sewing needle. You can also use a threading needle for this process. The one thing you want to be sure of is that your sewing needle is going to be thin enough to actually easily slide through the beads that you're using. So we're going to feed our yarn through the eye of the needle, and then we're going to use that needle to feed all of our beads onto our yarn. So let's get started. To incorporate beads without the use of a crochet hook, we're going to thread our beads onto our yarn before we begin working our project. To do this, you'll just need a threading needle or a fine sewing needle, and you want to be sure that this sewing needle is going to fit through whatever size beads that you're working with. And then you simply place each bead onto the needle and pull it onto your working yarn. So you do this whole process before you actually begin your knitting project. This can be a little bit time consuming, but if you don't have a very fine gauge crochet hook to work with, this is a really easy way to still be able to work with beading, and depending on your preference, you may find working this way, pre-straining all your beads onto your yarn a lot easier. So I'm just going to continue placing the beads onto my yarn until I've reached the number of beads that I need for my project. I've worked a few rows of my beading project where I've incorporated beads every so often on every right side row of my knitting. I've done this by stringing on all the beads for my project before I even started my knitting. So this was done before casting on. And now I'm going to show you how to use all those pre-strung beads and incorporate them into your stitches. So the first step is to get to the stitch that you want to add a bead to. And then we are going to pull up one of our pre-strung beads and incorporate them using the slip stitch method. So you can see I'm at a spot where I want to place a bead onto my stitch right here. What I'm going to do is slide up one bead from my pre-strung beads and place it close to my needles. And then we are going to bring our yarn forward, slip the next stitch from the left hand needle to the right needle, and then we're gonna move the bead as close as possible to the stitch and bring our working yarn to the back. And then we just continue on with our next stitch here. And so we've incorporated one bead using the slip stitch method. And again, I'm just going to work to my next spot and go ahead and repeat the whole process. So you can see here, I want to add another bead to my stitch here. I'm going to repeat the whole process by sliding up one of my pre-strung beads close to my needles. I'm going to go ahead and bring my yarn to the front, slip my stitch over to the right needle, move my bead close to the stitch, and then place my working yarn to the back. And then I'm just going to go ahead and work my next stitch. Now the slip stitch method is really great for this beading technique because it really keeps your beads in place, it keeps them laying neat and flat, and it also keeps them on whatever side you place them. So for example, all these beads on the right side of my work, they're actually going to stay on the right side since our slip stitch is behind them, and it's going to prevent them from pushing through and kind of going from the wrong side. So you won't see any of these beads on your wrong side, they're just going to stay neatly in place. Now there is another way for adding in your beads, but it's not as neat as the slip stitch method. So again, I'm at a point where I want to incorporate another bead. I'm going to begin in the same way by sliding up a bead close to my needles. And then for this method, I'm actually just going to knit that stitch, making sure that the bead comes through. So then you just go ahead, continue knitting. The only small problem with this method is that you can already see the bead is actually going to the back, since it's actually only on one of the two legs of the stitch. So it's kind of going to end up showing on the front and the back of your work, and sometimes it can get pushed to the wrong side. So again, it doesn't stay as nice and neatly in place as the slip stitch method here. You can see there's also potential for it to kind of slide around. Here it is on the other stitch. Again, it also is a little bit at an angle here. It doesn't lay as flat. And you just continue working your way, following your pattern, incorporating your beads. So I'm on my last stitch that needs bead. Just going to slide one more up. Bring my working yarn to the front, slip that stitch, move my bead up, make sure it's nice and close, pull my working yarn back, and then work to the end of my row. And that's how you incorporate beads into your knitting using the stranding method, where you pre-string all your beads. So you can see that this method is fairly fast, really effective. The only thing is you're going to have to spend some time stringing all those beads onto your yarn before you even begin your project. And this can be quite a daunting task when you're talking about 50, 100, 200 beads for a larger, say, lace project. But you'll be able to work them in really nicely, very neatly, and pretty quickly. So this is a great technique to use when you have a lot of heavy beading to incorporate into your knitting.